Welcome back to this week's episode of Thoroughly Entertained. This week, Krista and I are going to talk about the big new adaptation of The Great Gatsby. We're also going to talk about Tyler Perry's new movie, Peeples. And please go to our website and put in your email address so you can get our summer movie guide so that you know what's going on in the theater every weekend.
In the classic American tale, The Great Gatsby, Nick Carraway moves to Long Island and is instantly seduced by his mysterious neighbor, Jay Gatsby, who throws the most extraordinary and lavish parties. Ultimately, all Gatsby wants to do is to be reunited with his lost love, Daisy.
Okay, so we saw The Great Gatsby, and tell me kind of what you thought about it.
Well, first, before I talk about what we liked about the movie, since The Great Gatsby is based off the iconic novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald, the question that we had this week was, what is your favorite adaptation from a book? This, however, is not our favorite adaptation of this particular book, but we'll get to that in a second. Right. It was, because we don't enjoy the source material, and this is not my favorite story. I didn't like reading the book in high school. I didn't like reading it again when I read it this week. Right. But I have to say, the movie is visually amazing. It's fantastic. Yeah, Baz Luhrmann does a brilliant job at creating the visuals of this movie.
Just the look of each of the characters. One of the things I kept thinking as I was watching it, I was like, man, I wish I owned like nice tailored suits like that. Like, I mean, the clothing is immaculate. Right. Like the camera shots as the camera follows Jay Gatsby's car through New York City, or as it sweeps through the party and shows you every different scene at the party. It's visually stunning, and I think it's, as far as that goes, it's Baz Luhrmann's best film to date. As far as how great the visuals look, how clean everything is, how sharp it is. And the balance between the visuals and the music is incredible too.
Right, I absolutely thought that the editing was creative and inventive. At times, Carraway is sort of writing this tale about what happened that particular summer, and even the words coming out, we saw it in 3D. This is the first use of 3D this year that I felt that it warranted the price of the ticket. Yeah. And so, I agree, Baz Luhrmann was spectacular in the crafting of this tale. It's just a shame that the story is so deplorable, quite honestly.
Yeah, because ultimately, to me, and I hadn't read the book before seeing the movie, but I read the book in the last couple of days just because I wanted to be familiar with any real plot differences, which there don't seem to be any glaring plot differences. It's a fairly faithful adaptation. But ultimately, what it struck me as is this is kind of a film about two rich, powerful men fighting over a woman and then ruining everyone else's lives in the process. And it's just not a story that interests me that much. And I don't find any of the characters to be particularly interesting. The one thing that I did like about the film, as far as the characters go, was I liked the play between Tobey Maguire's Nick Carraway and Elizabeth Debicki as Jordan Baker. I thought their scenes were interesting. I thought she has this kind of like sly, flirty, but very regal look to her, which was interesting. And there weren't very many of those scenes, which was kind of sad. But then when you read the book and find out what Nick Carraway really thinks about Jordan Baker, and how he thinks she's kind of a super dishonest and a liar, but aren't all women liars in that way? Like, that even kind of soured the scenes I did like between a couple of characters in the movie. So, for me, as brilliantly as it was done, I just wish the source material had been something that was better.
Well,
personally.
I do have to say the acting was spectacular, very strong. I particularly really enjoyed Leonardo DiCaprio's portrayal of Jay Gatsby, and I like that character. Even in the book, I like Jay Gatsby. Yeah. Like, I can understand why he does all of this stuff to win back a woman who he just loved so much that he just could never move past that love he had for her. And yeah, it brings him to his ruin and his death ultimately, but you know, Leonardo DiCaprio gives him charm and mystique, and he just really, like, you are drawn to him. I could see why Nick was so drawn to his neighbor, and you could see why people are entranced by who he was, and I really liked him. I thought he did a spectacular job as Gatsby.
And one of the good things that he does about the portrayal of Gatsby is because, as you find out in the book and in the film, that Jay Gatsby isn't everything that he says he is.
Of course not.
You know, the story that he tells at the beginning of the movie about who he is very different from the story he tells at the end of the movie. And one of the things I like about Leonardo DiCaprio's portrayal is, even though you don't know who he really is, you always feel like there's something you don't know about the man. Right. That there's something missing about what he's telling you. That there's a mystery about him that exists that you don't know, and that's a very subtle thing to play in a movie. And you know, Leonardo DiCaprio has really grown into being a great actor, whereas I think in his younger career when he was a big celebrity, I think he traded on his looks a lot, but I think he's really become a very fine actor
Super
in the intervening years.
yeah.
I mean, incredibly detailed. I mean, just the way he'd kind of pull his suit back and tuck his hands into his pockets was kind of like a little nervous affectation that he had. And when he gets stressed, and he'd compulsively be smoothing his hair back. Those are little tiny things that really inform you about like who the person is that he's playing, and it really makes him feel like a real person because of those tiny little things.
Right. Yeah. And like I said, the acting was strong. I ultimately gave the movie a B because it was so spectacular to watch. And I wish we'd had this adaptation of the movie when I was reading the book in high school, because it made it fun to watch, even though the source material, like Scott said, isn't my favorite sort of story. So that's why I thought it deserved at least a B, because it is worth seeing in the theater.
And for all the visual brilliance of the movie, again, for me, it'll always end up meaning story is everything for me, especially as it goes to films. I just don't think the story was interesting enough to be anything better than a C+. And so I gave it a C+, mostly on the backs of the performances and Baz Luhrmann's skill at directing it. But again, like, it's a D story for me, to be perfectly honest. I don't find any of the characters particularly interesting. I don't find, you know, the plot to be something I could really sink my teeth into. So for me, C+ was the best I could do. But if you go to the movies and you spend the extra money on the 3D, you will be getting your money's worth with the 3D. It's great. And if you're a big fan of the book, The Great Gatsby, and you think that's amazing, this movie will not disappoint you in the least. It will give you everything you want from it.
All right, so now we move on to Peeples.
In the new Tyler Perry comedy, Peeples, Wade Walker finds himself in a whole heap of trouble when he's meeting his girlfriend's parents for the first time. So the new Tyler Perry movie, Peeples, could essentially be described as an African-American version of Meet the Parents. I've read a bunch of different reviews of it that all reference that same thing. Ultimately, you know, you get the really good, nice guy meeting the overbearing, super stern, overprotective father, and no matter how hard he tries, he just keeps making things worse and worse and worse and can't gain any approval, basically.
Yeah, Craig Robinson has such a likable, every guy sort of charm to him in this role, and I appreciated him. I thought he was really solid, a great performance from him, and he really carries the film. And in its weak moments, the only thing I still liked was the fact that I liked him, and I liked his character, Wade Walker. Yeah,
he does a great job in his first really standout lead role as Wade Walker, and I think this movie kind of sets up that he's a reliable lead in a comedy now, that if you're making a comedy and you go, you know, I want somebody that's big and physical but also charming and interesting, like, that you can say Craig Robinson's my guy, that you want to put him in this movie. Right. The surrounding characters around him, the people that play the family, the Peeples, none of them are particularly likable. They're not supposed to be, I suppose, because they're supposed to be at odds with Wade Walker's character. But the sad thing about this movie was, for as many times as we laughed, and there were plenty of times that we laughed, I spent an equal amount of time disliking the people I was watching.
I totally agree. Kerry Washington, who plays Grace Peeples, the girlfriend of Wade Walker, is normally an amazing actress.
Yeah, she's great.
But in this movie, she plays it with such, like, it's so adolescent, like her role, and she's supposed to be a lawyer for the UN, like, I would assume powerful and self-assured and confident, and yet she turns out to be unreliable and dishonest, and, you know, and I just think, why is she ashamed of this guy who's so nice and good, even though he might not be as successful as perhaps other people she's dated, but there is nothing shameworthy in who he is as a person, and yet she acts as though she's ashamed of who he is almost the entire movie.
Well, and one of the things that they set up is, supposedly her family, the Peeples, are supposed to be like this kind of really well-respected family. Wade Walker refers to them as the Chocolate Kennedys. You know, the dad's a federal judge, and the mom used to be a famous singer, and you know, one of the daughters works for CNN as a news anchor, and so everybody in the family is accomplished and successful and all those things. So they're supposed to seem like an intimidating family, but one of the nice things about Craig Robinson's character is he never seems particularly intimidated by anybody.
No, not at all.
David Allen Greer plays the father, Virgil Peeples, and you see him keep trying to put Wade in his place, but you never feel Wade back down from him and be like, and cower away from him. He always goes, I understand you're an important person, but, you know, I'm a man too. I, you know, earn my money. I take care of my responsibilities. Right. And so I like the fact that he never kind of like wilts under the pressure, that he's always still kind of a grown man.
The single shining bright light of this movie is Malcolm Barrett, who plays Craig Robinson's brother, Chris Walker, and he is a riot in virtually every single scene he's in.
I love this guy.
And yeah, I'm a huge fan of his from Better Off Ted, the tragically underrated show that you can see on Netflix. Is just, he's spectacular. And but he is so funny, like I said, in every single scene, and I just wish the movie had been between Craig Robinson and Malcolm Barrett, because the chemistry that the two of them have is spectacular and hilarious. And, you know, literally tears running down my face. I was laughing so hard in one scene that he's in.
Yeah, he had the standout moment of the movie for me was when Malcolm Barrett does his improvised step routine, because he's wearing a fraternity sweatshirt when he meets Virgil Peeples for the first time, and so Virgil thinks that they're from the same fraternity. So he's like, oh, brother, oh, we're fraternity brothers, like, greets him warmly, much more warmly than he greets Wade, which is supposed to be fun. And so Virgil Peoples' father, so the grandfather and the father are both from the fraternity, and they're doing their step routine. I walk like this, and I walk like this, and I look for my brother, I walk like this. And so they get over to Chris, and the whole time Wade's in here going like, you gotta tell him you're not in this fraternity. And instead he's like, no man, I'm committed to this. And he jumps up and he does this improvised, ridiculous step routine that had me like grabbing my sides. I was laughing so hard. It is, and he is so committed.
Absolutely.
Like, no break, no smileys. Ooh, like every single movement just kills me. And like that is the funniest single scene in the entire movie. I thought it was brilliant, and I agree with you. I wish the whole movie could have just been the two of them. They were so funny together.
As a whole, I only could give this a C+. I thought at times a lot of the humor relied too much on sexual innuendo and bathroom, and sometimes a little juvenile for me. It did make me laugh a number of times, very loudly, and I want that in a comedy, but ultimately, I just wasn't a fan of, like, any of the Peeples, you know, and I just didn't care that much for the story.
Yeah, and ultimately in a movie like this, you're supposed to be rooting for this guy to overcome all the obstacles and win his girl, even in the face of long odds, but towards the end of the movie, I was actually hoping that Wade would dump her and leave. I was like, Wade, you should dump her, and then you and your brother should go on this long road trip, and the rest of the movie should be that. Like, you know, I almost don't want him to end up with Kerry Washington, because I almost think, like, he's too good for her. Right. For as lousy as she treats him this whole weekend. But I laughed so much during the movie that I did give it a B-. I did grade it a little bit higher than you, mostly just because I thought it was so funny for so much of the time. But the B- comes from the fact that, you know, a whole third of the movie I spent going, boy, I don't like a lot of these people that I'm looking at. So, B- for me, shaky B-, C+.
That's it for this week's episode of Thoroughly Entertained. We'll be back in 2 weeks with our look at the Fast and Furious 6. In the meantime, however, make sure to check out our website at thoroughlyentertained.com to see our review of Star Trek Into Darkness. As always, make sure to give us your email address so that you can get our summer movie guide, and join us on our quest to be thoroughly entertained.